we go. Hey everyone, it's Lloyd May again, and today I'll be giving you a brief introduction to accessible design for music makers. So what we'll accomplish in this lecture today will be to talk about the question, what is disability? An introduction to about 3 styles of accessible design, and then some applications to instrument and sound making that this could have. So let's get going. Let's start with this question. What is disability? I want you to please pause the video and write down just some associations with the word disability. Feel free to take about a minute or two and then unpause the video to continue. Alrighty. So what is disability? I'll mention some things that often come up when we do this exercise and see if they come up for you. But please save your notes and what you wrote down, and because we'll be discussing them in our synchronous session on Monday. So one thing that comes up very often is this idea of a diagnosis, something that's quite medical, like legally blind or cerebral palsy, disease and diagnosis language. Another thing that could come up is people, wheelchair users, deaf folks, etc. Third could be infrastructure, things that might help or aid people, like elevators, ramps, braille text, etc. Fourth could be systems. We could think about social advocacy, legal representation, systems of oppression. Fifth could be assistive technologies, like specific case of those infrastructures in point 3. These are things such as white canes, closed captions, etc. The sixth could be context, which is something like, a noisy room or accommodations not being provided for a person, things like that. Alrighty, so now that we've got maybe a feeling of, the rough things around disability, we can maybe answer this question. What is disability? Well, it's complicated. Disability is no one fixed thing in space, time, or culture. And like all other aspects of the human condition, such as sexual orientation or gender, individual and cultural understandings of these change over time, are fluid and contextual. But don't worry, we still have somewhere to start. We'll look at some models or lenses that people often use when discussing disability. We'll start off with the medical model. Now, in the medical model, a disability is an abnormality in the person, in the patient. It is a problem that's generally sought to be cured, and it's seen as a meaningful deviation from the normal. So, for example, having green eyes, which is a little more uncommon, is not seen as a meaningful deviation from the normal. But having something like ALS or cerebral palsy could be seen as a meaningful deviation. So something additional is needed to make the person normal again in the medical model. To illustrate these models, I'll use myself as an example, mainly to show how slippery the term disability can be, and to hopefully get you comfortable with talking about the full spectrum of disabilities freely in all its nuance and complexity, and thinking about how these terms apply to you in your life as well as your work. So disability is not a dirty word, and equally it is not a charity word. We can talk about it plainly and freely here. And you can maybe tell from my handsome pixel portrait that I wear glasses, a very common assistive technology nowadays, to such an extent that we don't even think of it as an assistive technology. I have an astigmatism, a very common condition that affects the shape of my eye, makes things blurry for me. I went to an optometrist when I was a child because I was having problems reading, and then I got glasses, and bam, I could read with little problem. So in South Africa, where I'm from, I'm actually just above the threshold for being considered legally blind, given my prescription. And this is just and this is not the case in America. So this is just to illustrate even further how contextual disability could be. So in my case, and many others, my vision is an abnormality. I don't see in a normal or traditional way. It is a problem. I could maybe danger those around me, or I could live a life that is less fulfilling. And it should be cured temporarily, with glasses, maybe permanently with something like LASIK. And I need something to make me normal. So I was disabled without glasses, and now that I have glasses, I am cured of the disability. We'll next talk about the social model, which is maybe a bit more of a current model of disability. I'll be using language from the wonderful Nymph Ralph, who is pictured here. This is a person with a really cool faded haircut and a nose ring looking up to the top left corner. And her original article is linked in the description. Oh, apologies there. Apologies for misgendering. So in the social model, a person is disabilitied by society's placing of barriers to different types of access in all facets of civil and social life through attitudes, the physical environment, and institutional norms. Okay, so there's quite a lot to unpack, but let's do it. So in the medical model, we had, disabled versus abled. Now in the social model, we have disabled versus enabled. So people are enabled by society, and those with impairments are disabled by society. So in the social model, a person is disabled or enabled by the society and social context that they're in. And like we mentioned, this is contextual and fluid, can change from day to day, hour to hour, situation to situation. It is not a critical fault or problem or abnormality in the person, and it is up to society to meaningfully include this person. And this requires us often to unlearn hierarchies of what we might deem productive, that certain people with impairments are unproductive, and productivity is something that we hold as the highest thing in society. So social model asks us to question that and say, hey, maybe that's not a very valid assumption. Maybe people are more than just robots who churn out productive things. So I'll re-examine my glasses wearing through the social model, my astigmatism. I see blurry things. It's not a problem. It's just a fact in the social model. Society at large provides glasses to me and understands that I function differently without them. If I woke up in the morning and I'm fiddling around for my glasses and there's little stigma attached to it. Therefore, I'm enabled in the vast majority of situations and would not consider myself to have a visual disability because of my glasses wearing. And lastly, there's no expectation for me to change. It's fine that I can wear glasses and it's socially accepted through the social model. And just a quick note on that, I am a cisgender white guy and give this analysis and example from my privileged glasses having perspective. Disability does not exist in a vacuum removed from other identities. It intersects with identities, specifically race and gender and country of origin in very powerful ways. So I just wanted to mention that. So now that we've looked at these two models, it seems pretty clear that there's a winner here. That the social model is maybe a little bit more up to date with our views, and the medical model seems, maybe a bit dusty almost. But I want to revisit the medical model now with a bit more of a generous description of it. Medical diagnosis can be extremely powerful for folks. Tom Shakespeare, who we'll talk about later, gives this incredible difference between a badge versus a label. A label, something that is given by someone in a position of power in the medical community, and, a person is labeled different or as such. Whereas a badge is like, oh, I've, been feeling this meaningful difference in my life from my peers. And I finally have the language now to talk about it. I am proudly a person with this thing. And it's also helpful shorthand to find communities for other folks, and also helpful shorthand when communicating with people. For example, if every single person you met, you had to explain the differences in your perception of the world, it might be quite taxing, but it could be helpful shorthand to be like, oh, I'm a person with ALS. And quite a few folks might know what that means, and that just makes the conversation move a lot quicker. And like I mentioned before, makes it a lot easier to find things like support and community groups of folks who share that experience and can come together. There's also this distinction in the medical model between normal versus traditional. So this comes to the idea of what is a meaningful difference. And this is always a big conversation in the medical community. And, especially in the past 10 and 20 years, has been updated, that it's no longer this very stern criteria. There are doctors and physicians and clinicians who have a much more fluid understanding that what is normal or traditional is very contextual to the person. And one place we see this quite heavily, for example, is the recommendation of getting cochlear implants for people who have hearing impairments. Audiologists now, well, some audiologists take into account whether the family and community use a sign and things like that, and might recommend not getting a cochlear implant, which might restore some level of hearing, in favor of them interacting solely through sign with their community. And last thing I want to chat about to revisit this model is the fact that in our very complex ecosystem of identity politics, the medical model is often seen as something that people can fall back on to avoid, again, what Tom Shakespeare calls the sweet glow of victimhood. This is basically to say it's a very formal rebuttal to people who try, for lack of a better term, gatekeep, who, at some time or another could bring up that a person is not disabled enough to ask for this or that, or be in this situation, or be in this club. And likely that the charity argument as well. So, you're playing up X and Y condition or impairment, to get W thing. And so the medical model, given its sort of weight in society, these medical diagnoses can often help people avoid this stigmatism and rebuttal of, oh, you just want the glow of victimhood. You want this thing for the benefits that it gives you. You're not actually this thing. So we can see that it's not really the social model versus the medical model. It's really the social model and the medical model and everything else. These are just lenses to look at what we mean by disability, which is this, beautifully complex topic. And just to wrap up this discussion of models, I'll just leave you with this wonderful quote from the statistician George Box. All models are wrong. Some models are useful. And if you're excited to learn more about this and have more of a critical lens on what disability looks like, and how people understand and talk about disability, the key word you'll want to use is disability studies when looking on Google Scholar or things like that. It's a sister discipline to queer studies, and it's rooted in a mix of activism, lived experience, and theory, and really wonderful. So the next thing I'll be talking about is some language regarding disability. There is a style guide that I've linked in the description, but I'll quickly breeze through some language around disability just to get us even more comfortable having these conversations in a more specific and nuanced way. So we can start off with this statement that, a person might make is, this thing I made is for disabled people. And throughout this section of the lecture, we're going to try and nuance that statement and try give more helpful and descriptive terms. We'll start by one way to think about disability, which is in terms of time. So you could have things like long-term disabilities. These are generally called congenital or permanent. These are generally impairments that a person has acquired when they were a baby or a small child, and have no known end point. Another could be an acquired disability. This is maybe one that a person acquired later in life or has developed slowly over time. The next could be a temporary disability, and we often don't really think of these. Like, for example, if someone sprained their ankle and are wearing a brace and crutches, they would have a temporary disability when moving around, possibly, having trouble going upstairs. And the shortest term is something that we call a situational impairment, which we talk even less about and maybe don't even think of as a disability, which is, for example, like a parent who's trying to tend to a baby and has their hands full while also trying to open a door. The next we'll talk about is this distinction between visible and invisible disabilities. So this is different to visual. Visible disabilities does not solely include people with blind and low vision. That is a common confusion. So visible disabilities are just more apparent to folks in society. So, for example, things like a motor disability, which could result in someone using a wheelchair, a person who is blind and using a guide dog or a cane, or a deaf person using sign language. These are all visual cues to society at large that that person has a disability, or they are presenting in a way that tells society they have a disability. And then the next and often underspoken about and represented forms of disability are what we call invisible disabilities, because they don't really have these strong visual presentations in society. So these could be things like chronic pain, dyslexia, and other learning disorders, and mental health conditions. And like I mentioned, these are harder to depict in society, and therefore are often under-advocated for and under-designed for, just saying. And there are some best practice terms when talking about folks with disabilities. I don't want this to come across as dogmatic or policing people's language. These are fluid and change very much from community to community, and I really encourage you to take whatever community you're talking about to take on their norms of how they prefer to be addressed. But when in doubt, use what we call person-first language. So sorry, I know this table can be a bit overwhelming, but you can come back to it for reference. But if we look at everything in the green column, it always starts with person. Person with a disability, person who is blind, person with autism. Like I mentioned, this is not neutral by any means. Some communities definitely prefer other types of language, but this is best practice. If you know nothing else about the community, person with is great. And equally, it's strongly encouraged to not use able-bodied to refer to people without disabilities. It's generally advised to use the term non-disabled rather than able-bodied. Alrighty, so now we can maybe refine that phrase that we came up with in the beginning. So instead of, this thing I made is for disabled people, we can nuance that now to this thing I made is for Paul Smith, a real person, and they are a person with acquired blindness. They use a white cane, and therefore their disability status is quite visible in public. So you can see how this language is not only helpful and empowering for communities, but also very much for designers, because it gives us the language and jargon to be able to talk about these concepts that maybe feel a little fluid. And there's lots more nuance to language, and I encourage you to really check out the style guide, especially if you're writing about folks with disabilities. But hopefully this was a good primer. I'll invite you now, feel free to pause and get some water or anything if you'd like, and then press play and we'll carry on. And the last thing we'll talk about before moving on to the next subsection is the representation. These two camps of representation that we maybe see quite often on the media, and again, I just want to maybe provide us some language for how to talk about that. So the first I'll talk about is what we might call capital letter representation. So, and this comes actually mainly from the deaf community, who prefer capital D deaf when referring to the community, and lowercase d deaf when referring to it as like a medical condition. But for example, this is a picture of Christine's son Kim, an Asian American woman in a blue top, currently looking to the top left. And she works primarily in visual and signed media, and ascribes herself as a deaf sound artist, explores the concept of deafness very much in her work. It's very much on the forefront of what she does. Her deafness is very present in her work. So that might be what we call capital letter representation, in that the work is by a person with a specific disability, generally exploring the themes of that disability in a very legible way. And then on the other end of the spectrum, is what we might call happens to be representation. For example, Stevie Wonder might be described as a singer who happens to be blind. And here's a picture of Stevie Wonder in the 80s as a black man with sunglasses, smiling, surrounded by many synthesizers. And these two are really on a spectrum that can change over time and is by no means ascribed, but they definitely feel different. And I just wanted to give us the language to talk about that and maybe take notice of if we're seeing folks with disabilities being portrayed in media, for example, if it's more capital letter or more happens to be, or maybe something that's neither, specifically in advertising campaigns, for banks or insurance, we might see representations of disability that are on this axis or maybe feel a little different. And I'll invite you to think critically about that now that we have a bit more of a feel of the landscape. I'll again invite you to pause and take a break if you'd like. There's no need to rush through this material. Alrighty, so we'll be jumping into 3 models of accessible design. So these are universal design, inclusive design, ability-based, and the bonus one I'm going to give is designing social technologies. So let's start with universal design, which you might have heard of before and is probably the most what I would call popular of the schools of accessible design. So the goal of universal design is to make things accessible to all people, regardless of disabilities, race, gender, etc. And this is generally seen by folks as a principle to strive towards. There's no, assumption in the community that every single human being on earth is going to be able to use the thing that I make using universal design. But it is this goal to strive towards, to allow or enable folks to use the thing that I've made in as many ways as possible. And generally, universal design congregates to what we call single solution thinking. So it's really, I'm making this thing, and how can I make this one thing accessible to as many people as possible? And they are related to movements that you might have heard of, such as Design for All, barrier-free design, which actually they are using as their term in the Tokyo 2020 Olympic design, and inclusive design, only in the UK in the 1990s. If you've never heard of that in that context, absolutely don't worry about it, but just wanted to bring that up as some folks could get confused about that. And there are often these seven principles that get cited around universal design. Some folks have, added and updated these, but these are the 7 sort of core principles that came out of universal design groups in the early days of like the 80s and 90s. One is to have things that require low physical effort, that give size and space for the user to approach it and to use it. Third is equitable use, which just means that people of different needs are accommodated while using the thing, that everyone is not potentially given the exact same thing, they're given the thing that they need. Again, this is equitable versus equal. Flexibility in use, that it's not a single thing, that it can be used in multiple situations and circumstances, that it is simple and intuitive. I would argue that's just a good design principle. Tolerance for error, it tries not to be too exacting of its users, and perceptible information, that things are readily accessible. The information regarding the product is readily accessible. And the classic poster child of universal design is the curb cut. While it is billed as allowing folks with motor and movement disabilities to more easily access a sidewalk or a pavement, they've helped many other folks, including those with suitcases, wheeling delivery carts. The list goes on and on. Even big trucks who, when turning, often cut curbs. It resulted in fewer pop tires in Berkeley, where this was first implemented in the early 2000s. So it had a lot of run-on positive effects and is often heralded for those. But it is also an unfortunate child of universal design, as this picture, which I really, really love, illustrates so well. When universal design is taken out of meaningful context, it does break down a bit, and we can see this problem of trying to design for a universal. So the grass patches on either side of this sidewalk would make it very difficult for folks who are using mobility aids such as wheelchairs, or even folks who are wheeling around suitcases or delivery carts. Like, it's, great that the person could mount the pavement, but now what? And even those bumps that we often see, are great for folks who are using a cane or who are blind or low vision, but they can cause pain for folks with certain joint conditions and arthritis. So while those in the universal design camp strive towards the universal, like I said, it's well understood that it doesn't exist, and all of these are messy. The next we'll be talking about is inclusive design. And again, this is different from the inclusive design of the UK in the 90s. If you've never heard about that, don't worry. Inclusive design focuses very heavily on individuals. This is equated to what we might call bespoke design, where something is made very specifically for a person and their very specific requirements. Naturally, given its specificity, it scales differently. It's trickier to have designed something for a single person and then now release it to a bunch of people. But it does also rely on more designer-user interaction, which can lead to some very exciting and different design outcomes than something like universal design might. And inclusive design only has 3 principles. All the design schools have principles. The first is to recognize exclusion, is to see how current solutions are not doing the job. Second is to solve for one, extend to many. Really hone in on this bespoke design for this one person, learn some lessons, and then see if it can be extrapolated. And the third is learn from diversity. Diversity of people, diversity of use cases, etc. And the last is one that I'll quickly mention, is a new one that's gaining some traction, which is ability-based design. And it has the great tagline, focus on what individuals can do, not what they can't do. So basically, this is what I would argue as an update on universal design that offers some customization and adaptability to it. So there are the 7 principles of ability-based design. And I would invite you to dig a little bit more about it if you think this interests you. And instead of just rattling off the principles, I'll mainly highlight the first and what I would consider the most important one, which is ability. Again, focus on what people can do rather than what they can't do. So this means, for example, if we were designing an interface for a museum that used Braille text, for example, in an ability-based design paradigm, our brief wouldn't be, we want to make this text accessible to blind people, to people who can't see, which might be a more traditional brief. In ability-based design, it'd be like, we want to make text that is accessible to Braille readers, to people who can read Braille. It sounds like a very small change, but by focusing on ability as opposed to disability, we get invited to this exciting and possibly new design space. The last one, this is the half school I'll just quickly mention, is designing social technologies. So like we mentioned previously, disability is married to social context, does not occur as an island. And oftentimes, technology alone is not the solution. And I know that it may hurt us as designer and engineers, but it is definitely worth noting. And oftentimes, it can be the problem, really, because it shifts responsibility from society, who should be providing accommodations, to the person with the disability to, get the newest and latest, greatest piece of technology to be able to interact with society. So a great case study of this is what we call relaxed performances. So this is specifically targeted with folks who might have like unwanted vocal utterances, such as Tourette's or something like that, as well as, you know, parents with babies and things like that, who struggle to attend normal performances, you know, plays, poetry readings, etc. Mainly because of the social stigma. It's not that what's being presented on stage is in some way inaccessible to them. It's the social stigma that's associated with maybe them not performing or behaving in a specific way as an audience member. So more and more we're seeing venues have these relaxed performances where there's no technology involved. All it is a social technology of telling folks that, hey, this is a relaxed performance, which means that we understand there are going to be folks in the audience who may behave in a non-traditional manner to what we might expect from audience members. So that's just to say that not all innovative solutions in accessible design require technology. And I've been using this term, accessible design, and just a quick note on that. Generally, it's an umbrella term that holds this and many other great schools of design underneath it. So I would advise if ever you're talking, you know, approximately about this space, to just use the term accessible design. And I will once again invite you to pause and take a break, which is exactly what I'm going to do, and go get some water. Alrighty, and I'm back from getting a drink of water. So the final thing we'll chat about are some applications to instrument and sound making. So first is, you know, why is it important to consider disability when designing? So you get the opportunity to design for an underserved population. This is maybe the flashiest and most common reason that people cite. So the World Health Organization estimates there are about 1 billion people living with disabilities worldwide. So while they're often underserved, they're by no means a small group of people. It invites you to explore and expand your own sense of ability and disability and the fluidity through which these two concepts move. And accessible design is kind of often just good design, and thinking about these principles and use cases will hopefully move everything you make to a more positive direction, and to have your users have a better experience using your instrument, even if your user is just yourself. Which is the first rebuttal. You know, that's nice, but my instrument is just for me. The rebuttal to that would be, well, it's your audience as well, you know, and it doesn't have to just be for you. It's generally far easier to design something accessible from the ground up than it is to augment something that's already in the world. And we are not single sensory beings. We rely on what we call multi-sensory integration. So this means that what we hear impacts how we see, and vice versa. So it's all to say that, you know, instruments don't just make sound, they also look and feel a certain way. And thinking about these in relation to ability and disability could be exciting. The last thing is ability fluidity, you know, such as situational impairments and temporary disabilities. A great example could be stage lighting, which is often spotty and doesn't let us see exactly what we're doing. And you can imagine many other cases. And I'll just throw in accessible design is often just good design. So some quick suggestions just to get us thinking, you know, as you go forward into this workshop and focus more on your projects. First is, what is the casual mode of your instrument? Is there a core interaction of your instrument, and how easily can you access it? Can you incorporate another channel of performer feedback? So this is feedback that your instrument is giving to the person using it. This could be haptic, visual, a different auditory cue, etc. A great piece of advice that I got is to put bumper dots for low light performance. So just little stickers on very important buttons so that you can get to them in low light situations. Can you modularize functionality? If one thing breaks or one gesture isn't usable, can you still use your instrument in a way that is satisfying? And lastly, can you build in possibilities to customize? Again, far easier to do these things before rather than after. So hopefully that stirred your interest and got us thinking about disability and ability in a critical way, and sort of whet our palates to think about how we could incorporate some of these critical ideas into our instruments. The last thing I'll leave is just a very popular phrase in the accessible design community, which is nothing about us without us. And this came from disability advocacy in the 80s and 90s, I believe. And it's all just to say, please do not design for a group of people without their direct involvement. It is, totally okay to have an instrument that you're building and think about, these different folks who might use it, and let that, explore and flex your thinking. That's really beautiful, and we encourage that. But we would encourage you to think more about saying like, this instrument is for this community. If members of that community weren't directly involved and gave you feedback throughout the process. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in later versions of the workshop. I'll leave us with a reflection, and we'll chat about this in Monday's discussion. But how does disability intersect with your life, your practice, your music making? Now that we have this critical lens, we can just take a moment to reflect maybe on some of the more non-obvious cases in how disability and ability impact what we do. All right, that is the end of the lecture. Thank you very much for getting through it. And I look very, very forward to speaking with you guys on Monday. Ciao for now.